folks. We have talked about how the inspiration for the Chaneysville incident was those graves, those dozen runaways, the graves with the triangular stones. And you've spent the book reading about those, excuse me, folks. You've spent the book reading about those voices in the wind in the night, those last voices of the runaways, that mystic element. Now, as we got to the end, the C.K. Washington story, well, first, as John Washington began that wild ride undertaken in the middle of a snowstorm, he had to go then, at that moment, to find those graves and took off with Judith seeking them. Well, he started off talking about history, the fugitive slave law, the source of the Dred Scott decision, every bit of accumulated ugliness he could muster, that along with the C.K. Washington story, the history that he had put together as a historian. It stopped him short of answers. Finally, he reaches the drive in the snowstorm. He and Judith reach that place where Moses Washington killed himself. They discover the graves. They discover the 12 together, the 13th one off just a bit to the side, and they discover them sitting adjacent to the Iams family cemetery. And they discover the graves together. This is important, the coming together. We are going to finally step past John Washington's bitterness into that empathy, understanding, care, and sense of loss. Moses Washington had discovered the graves. He found them, and that's why he blew his brains out where he did. Blew his brains out being Bradley's words. That is the words he puts in John Washington's mouth. So we noted here, and we talked about Moses Washington off to join the fight. After discovering the graves, after all of this, well, John, back in Jack Crawley's cabin, can sit down with Judith and explain the singing and Moses Washington's discovery, and then Moses Washington's theology. We have been through that variously working here, that Moses Washington believed he was going to join up and fight a fight that never ends, because that singing and panting, that singing is a soft panting, and that panting is the panting, the breath of those runaways still running. And finally, at 392, page 392, at Judith's behest, John Washington gives up trying to be the precise historian, the bitter, angry one who claims he is just stating the facts, and turns into the storyteller. We get more like Bradley's voice here, because Bradley obviously is a storyteller, but Bradley wrote it all, so it's his story. But he turns his John Washington from historian to storyteller, and John Washington tells this story that is full of male bravery. C.K. Washington and his grand scheme to end slavery by prompting mass runaways fleeing into the hills and all of this, and circulating his name. Yes, I am the Redeemer, this magic figure who by his name would inspire. Runaways would inspire terror. People can establish names and do these things in the face of the incredible. I don't know quite how it's mastered. In World War II, a Norwegian diplomat, by virtue of his name and assertions, freed thousands of Jews, stopped their flight to the concentration camps simply by showing up and announcing his name and saying no. There was nothing he could do with his name except invoke it, but invoking it was enough. C.K. Washington wanted that kind of name, to just be able to invoke it. And then we have the other side, Pettus, slave hunter, representative of all the slave hunters, a kind of, yes, similarly magical figure to C.K. Washington, the adversary. And they are in battle. But, and from page 412 forward, we get this. We know that Harriet Brewer went south herself to bring back a contingent of these slaves and was captured, was stuck there, and we have the story of her escape. And we get our, well, real hero, the heroine duly modeled after Harriet Tubman, the one who really went forth from the South without reasonable hope, with full desperation, but the knowledge and that North Star and that desire for freedom. We have women, children, and old men, not the young man who would run until tired, who would give up, would be recaptured, and such, but the ones who are gifted with persistence, who would not give up, who would not turn. There was nothing except that one goal, freedom, that it was worth more than life. Nothing would end their quest but death. So Harriet Brewer, with three other women, 7 children, and an old man, made their way north. And made their way into Pettus's grand trap. This is described, but meantime we have them then at the mill. Crawley and Graham weren't able to meet them and send them on their way, help them on their way, because it was a trap. They could not go there without leading the slavers smack into them. There was nothing they could do, and we have then this contingent, this dozen people on the verge of death, and we have this thought reverberating: before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and be free. We'll note the presence of a child named William, which appears to be C.K. and Harriet Brewer's child. That name, William, that think of John Washington's brother, Bill. Think of the recurrence, the naming, the significance. Their flight north is described. They are described individually, these who have fled, and you get to see in them the heart, the depth of heart. We see them exhausted in the mill, and then we see the last flight from the mill, C.K. Washington leading them as very best C.K. Washington can, leading them down any possible successful end, but there is none. They are surrounded. So we come to the end, exhausted, nowhere to go, and that final yes chorus of "Before I'll Be a Slave," as they, Harriet Brewer, began the singing, all were singing, as she neatly slit the throat of each one. C.K. Washington then killed her and himself, or that appears to be the order that John Washington is offering. And so it is done. They have moved to the next life. And Moses Washington thought in that next life, they were still running. Nothing was changed. They were still running. John Washington, I am not sure what he thinks in that regard. He appears to follow his father's example on that. But, the big but, as we hear them here, voices on the wind, and ask, is there something other than this eternal fight? And Bradley says yes with the ending, because John Washington figures out who buried them. They are beside the Iams family plot, Iams the miller. So, unlike what Moses Washington thought, no, they were not buried by Crawley and Graham. Rather, they were buried as family, with the dignity of family, by a white man. Judith asks, why? He was white. And we think and look and think of Judith's skin and say, yes, so is she. If we're a fair portion of Bradley's audience, we can look at our own skin. There we go, get my hand up here. Pretty pale, isn't it? Daggone pink, isn't it? Yes. We, who are white, can read this. The message is reconciliation, the final one. A reconciliation not in empty compromise, not in giving up, but the reconciliation, the kind that says that, yes, we, like Judith, can say, yes, you are a human being, and this can be accepted, and we can join. We can do better things than beat, rape, kill, chase, and all the rest of this for our afterlife, or for this life. The story can be for every one of us. It can be something more than John Washington's bitterness. And so we hit the end, the last page, and from the description, it appears John Washington is in the process of killing himself, that he is going to step right into that pyre that he has made of his note cards and such as that, and he, ledger, and everything are going to burn. And there are two things we get from this, in that this is the end of John Washington's bitterness, his figuring out who it was that buried his ancestor, buried these runaways matters. And he kills himself not down there to join the fight, down by that old graveyard, but by Jack Crawley's cabin, where Jack Crawley fashioned his life, lived his independent existence, his way, where Jack Crawley was free, and probably the only place that John Washington could be free, not with the weight he was carrying. And his other final thought, what does he leave behind? That story for Judith, I hope Judith will understand. That one is essential. I hope the white world will understand. I hope humanity will understand. All of us. So after all of this bitterness, and we were full of bitterness, some action going on. We got our deer hunt. We got the C.K. Washington and chase. We got John Washington driving like a maniac through the snowy hills of Pennsylvania, a kind of driving that I've some familiarity with. Yes, I know people who drove like that. I didn't, because I couldn't drive well enough to drive like that. I would have killed myself if I tried. But yes, plenty of action and such as that. Otherwise, so much of John Washington's bitterness, and then the end, stepping beyond that bitterness to try to join Jack Crawley in freedom, to try to end with that final, genuine empathy deserved by and worthy of our tears. Those runaways, those last graves, those who would be buried in their grave and be free. Okay, that's the book as I read it, or that last segment, the big one, that I'm of the opinion you'll have to really care about, folks. Rest.